They called me the drama queen for caring too much about compliance. 6 weeks later, the entire executive team had to read my trashed audit report out loud, the one they'd literally dragged into the recycle bin during a board meeting in front of 700 investors and 2 SEC representatives. I sat in my Denver apartment, sipping Cabernet, watching my former COO stutter through slide 13 while sweat stained his $2,000 shirt. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting mad. It's getting documentation. My name is Ava Burnell, and at 34, I'd already cleaned up enough corporate messes to know when one was about to explode. As head of internal audit at Data Fluxus, a rapidly growing SaaS company in Charlotte, North Carolina, I'd spent 3 years being the person nobody wanted to see coming, the one who asked uncomfortable questions, the one who actually read the fine print. Our Series D funding round was 6 months away, and the executives were practically salivating over the projected $300 million valuation. New glass offices were being installed on the 40th floor. The marketing team had already leaked unicorn status imminent to TechCrunch. Everyone was drinking the Kool-Aid except me because I was the one who knew what was actually in it. The compliance system was a disaster, not the sexy kind of disaster that makes headlines, but the slow-burning kind that ends with federal investigations and executives in handcuffs. Expired software licenses worth millions. Financial data that didn't match between systems. Audit findings from last year that had been marked resolved without any actual resolution. The kind of boring details that make investors run for the exits. I'd been hired to clean things up, they said. What they meant was, make the problems disappear on paper. Make us look good for due diligence. Be a team player. Ava. Then Brad Keaton arrived. Our new chief operating officer came with a resume that read like a Silicon Valley fairy tale. 3 successful exits, a Harvard MBA, golf buddies with half the venture capitalists on Sand Hill Road. He wore Hermes ties and spoke in TED Talk soundbites. The board loved him, the C-suite worshipped him, and from day one, he looked at me like something unpleasant he'd stepped in. Our first real clash came during the Q3 leadership meeting. I'd prepared a 40-page audit report detailing critical compliance failures, not suggestions or nice-to-haves, but actual violations that could shut us down. As I walked the executives through my findings, Brad kept checking his phone, occasionally smirking at whatever was on his screen. "Question," he interrupted, not looking up. "How many of these are actual problems versus, let's call them theoretical concerns?" I kept my voice steady. "These are all documented violations with supporting evidence. Page 12 shows the timeline for our Cloud Sincera license expiration. If we don't renew by—" Right. He finally looked at me, and his smile was all teeth. "Here's the thing, Ava, we're building a rocket ship here, not a compliance museum, maybe in your previous roles. This level of pessimism was appreciated. But here at Data Fluxus, we focus on growth metrics, not bureaucratic checkboxes." The room temperature seemed to drop. Other executives shifted in their seats, eyes darting between us like spectators at a tennis match. "These aren't bureaucratic checkboxes," I said. "They're legal requirements. The SEC." Brad laughed, actually laughed. "The SEC isn't going to care about some expired licenses when we're disrupting an entire industry." He turned to the others. "This is what I mean about old-school thinking holding us back." Then he did it, the thing that would later cost him everything. He reached across the conference table, grabbed my report, and with theatrical flair, dragged the PDF into his desktop trash bin on the screen everyone could see. "Nice paranoia, Doc, Princess," he said. "But maybe next time, try focusing on how we can win instead of why we might lose." The room erupted in nervous laughter. Even our CEO, Marcus, cracked a smile. I sat there, face burning, watching my 40 hours of work disappear into a digital wastebasket while a room full of grown men chuckled at my expense. I didn't argue, didn't defend myself, didn't even blink. I just smiled and said, "Of course, I'll revise my approach." But as I gathered my things and left that conference room, I'd already made my decision. If they wanted to ignore the fire alarms, fine, but I'd make damn sure I had proof of who disabled them when the building burned down. That night, I went home to my 1-bedroom apartment, poured myself a generous glass of wine, and created a new folder on my personal encrypted drive. I named it Burn Notice Zip. Inside, I saved a copy of the report Brad had so publicly trashed. The timestamp read for our 47 p.m., May 9th. I had no idea that 6 weeks later, he'd be reading every word of it out loud to 700 people. But I knew something he didn't in corporate America. The paper trail always wins. The thing about being gaslit at work is that it makes you question your sanity. Was I overreacting? Was I really the drama queen Brad had branded me for about 12 hours after that meeting? I almost believed it. Then I opened my laptop and started documenting everything. Not for revenge. I told myself that over and over. This was just insurance, professional due diligence, the same methodical approach I applied to every audit, except now the subject was my own career assassination. I started with the basics, the original audit report, saved as Audit Final Princess Edition. Yes, I was that petty. Then I added the meeting recording our IT system automatically captured. The beauty of working at a tech company is that everything leaves a digital footprint, even when people think they're being clever. Next came the Slack messages. Brad had created a private channel called Core Team Sync that I wasn't invited to, but Slack's audit logs, which I had legitimate access to as head of internal audit, told a different story. Messages about managing the Ava situation and need to minimize her influence before investor meetings. I screenshot everything, adding them to my growing archive. The emails were even better. A forward chain where Brad instructed the junior audit staff to run any findings by me before sharing with Burnell. Another where he told the CFO that my concerns were technically accurate, but strategically naive, each one time-stamped, authenticated, and backed up in triplicate. Within a week, my burn notice zip had grown to include version histories showing altered audit findings, deleted calendar invites where I'd been uninvited from key meetings, expense reports showing Brad's team dinners where they discussed restructuring audit responsibilities, a particularly damning email where he asked HR about performance improvement plans for employees who don't align with company culture. I wasn't paranoid, I was prepared. The marginalization started subtly. My direct reports were suddenly borrowed for special projects. My standing agenda item in leadership meetings got pushed to time permitting and time never permitted. When I raised concerns about our Cloud Sincera contract coming up for renewal, Brad responded to the group email without including me. Already handled. Moving forward, vendor management will report through operations. He wanted me to quit. That much was obvious. Make my life miserable enough that I'd take my compliance concerns and my negative attitude somewhere else. Let me be someone else's problem. But I didn't quit. I showed up every day. Professional blazer pressed. Audit checklist in hand. I submitted my reports through the proper channels. Even though I knew they were being buried, I attended every meeting I was still invited to, taking notes in my leather-bound journal while Brad made jokes about death by PowerPoint whenever I presented. Late at night, after everyone had gone home, I'd walk the empty halls of our Charlotte office. The city lights sparkled below, all that glass and steel ambition. I'd stand in the server room sometimes, listening to the hum of machines that held millions of customer records, secured by systems I knew were one expired certificate away from catastrophic failure. I added more to my archive. Photos of server error logs, screenshots of security warnings, the email from Cloud Sincera's account manager asking why we hadn't responded to their renewal notices forwarded to Brad, Marcus, and the entire board. Naturally, all marked FYI only because I was done begging them to listen. My favorite addition was the recording of Brad's all-hands presentation about our revolutionary approach to rapid scaling. Mine 37. We don't let bureaucracy slow us down. Minute 41. Sometimes you have to break a few rules to change the world. Minute 52. Anyone who isn't comfortable with our pace should consider whether this is the right fit. The camera had caught my face in the audience. I was smiling. By week 3, I'd accumulated 4 gigabytes of evidence. Not of wrongdoing that was already in my original report. This was evidence of willful ignorance, of leadership that chose to mock the messenger instead of addressing the message, of a culture that valued swagger over substance. I upgraded my personal encryption, enabled 2-factor authentication, and created multiple backups across different cloud services. One copy stayed on an encrypted USB drive in my apartment safe. Another lived on a personal server I'd set up years ago. The third? Well, the third copy had special plans. "You seem happier lately," my colleague Sarah mentioned one morning. "Less stressed." "Just focusing on what I can control," I told her, sipping my coffee. What she didn't know was that I'd stopped trying to save them. I was now just documenting the fall. Every dismissed warning, every ignored email, every handled issue that wasn't actually handled, it all went into my files. I wasn't building a case, I was building a time capsule. A perfect record of how a $300 million company decided that compliance was optional and that the person trying to protect them was the enemy. Brad thought he'd won by trashing my report. He thought humiliation was the end of the story. He had no idea it was just the beginning of the documentation. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning at 8:43 a.m. I was reviewing our software asset inventory, a task Brad had graciously left me after taking over strategic vendor relationships, when the subject line made my coffee cup freeze halfway to my lips. Urgent Cloud Sincera service confirmation required. I opened it slowly, already knowing what I'd find. Our largest software vendor, the one that powered 60% of our data analytics, was requesting immediate confirmation of our license renewal. The grace period had expired. Without payment confirmation by Friday, services would be suspended. This wasn't a surprise. I'd flagged this 3 months ago, 2 months ago, and again in the report Brad had so ceremoniously trashed. Each warning had been met with "it's handled," or "operations is on it," or my personal favorite, "Stop crying, wolf, Ava." I forwarded the email to Brad, Marcus, and the CFO with a simple note, "FYI, appears to require immediate action." Brad's response came 12 minutes later, CCing half the company. "Already in discussion with Cloud Sincera. Please focus on your assigned priorities. Ava." I smiled and took a screenshot, added it to a new subfolder I'd labeled Critical Vendor Ticking Time Bomb, PDF. But this time, I did something different. I also forwarded the original Cloud Sincera email to my personal Gmail, using the company's own policy that allowed backing up critical business communications, just in case. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in corporate theater. I watched Brad's assistant frantically calling Cloud Sincera, overhead hushed conversations about payment processing delays and procurement miscommunications. Saw the color drain from our CFO's face when he realized the renewal cost had increased by 40%, since last year, an increase I'd budgeted for in my ignored report. On Thursday afternoon, things got interesting. A different kind of email landed in my inbox. This one from an address I didn't recognize, compliancereview@cc.gov. My heart rate spiked as I read the subject, Informal Inquiry, Data Fluxus Inc., Software Licensing and Revenue Recognition Practices. The SEC had sent what they called a voluntary request for information. Nothing formal, not an investigation, just some friendly questions about our software asset management and how we recognized revenue from products that relied on third-party licenses. Someone had talked, maybe a former employee, maybe a competitor, maybe Cloud Sincera themselves, tired of being stiffed by a company claiming a $300 million valuation while unable to pay their bills on time. I sat back in my chair, staring at the email. This was it. The spark that would light the fuse I'd been carefully laying for weeks. I did what any responsible head of internal audit would do. I immediately forwarded it to legal, with Brad and Marcus CC'd. My note was professionally neutral. Please advise on appropriate response protocol. Happy to compile any requested documentation. The explosion was immediate. My desk phone rang. Brad's assistant, emergency leadership meeting in 5 minutes. The C-suite conference room was chaos when I arrived. Legal huddled in one corner, furiously typing on laptops. Brad paced by the windows, his Harvard composure cracking. Marcus sat at the head of the table, looking like he'd aged 5 years in 5 minutes. How the hell did the SEC find out about licensing issues? Brad demanded the moment I walked in. I don't have that information, I said calmly, taking my usual seat. But I have comprehensive documentation of all our licensing statuses if that would be helpful. Your documentation is what caused this, Brad snapped. Someone obviously leaked your paranoid report. I met his gaze steadily. The report that was deleted, that report. The room went silent. Our general counsel, Janet cleared her throat. We need to focus on response, not blame. Ava, how quickly can you compile our current licensing status? I have it ready, I said, pulling out my laptop. I've maintained updated records despite the transition of vendor management to operations. Brad's jaw clenched. Of course you have. As I projected the data onto the screen, the full scope of our situation became clear. 7 critical licenses expired or expiring, $2 million in delayed payments, revenue recognition on products we technically couldn't sell because we didn't have valid underlying licenses. Jesus Christ, Marcus whispered. This is all in my May 9th report, I said quietly, pages 12 through 27. The May 9th report doesn't exist, Brad said through gritted teeth. It was deemed unnecessarily alarmist and removed from the record. I see, I nodded thoughtfully. Should I inform the SEC that we have no documentation of known compliance issues that seems problematic? Janet's head snapped up. No, we absolutely cannot say that. She looked between Brad and me. If a report exists, we need it, now. I'm sure it can recover deleted files, I offered helpfully, though that might raise questions about why it was deleted. The meeting devolved into damage control strategies and finger-pointing. But I noticed something for the first time in weeks. People were looking at me differently, not as the drama queen or the paranoid compliance officer, but as the person who might have the documentation that could save their asses. That night, I updated my archive with a new folder, SEC Inquiry Response. Inside, I carefully saved every email, every panicked Slack message, every revised action plan that tried to retroactively address issues I'd identified months ago. I also noticed something interesting in our email server logs. Brad had spent 3 hours that evening trying to recover the deleted report from his trash. The same report he'd so confidently dismissed as a paranoia doc. The timestamp on his last attempt was 11:47 p.m. I poured myself a glass of wine and made a backup of my backup. The fire was spreading now, and everyone was scrambling for extinguishers. Too bad they'd thrown away the person who'd been pointing out the smoke. The next 2 weeks were a masterclass in corporate panic. I watched from my desk as data fluxes transformed into a frantic hive of retroactive compliance. The same executives who'd laughed at my paranoia were now pulling all-nighters trying to create documentation that should have existed months ago. Legal brought in external consultants at $5,000 per day. Finance worked overtime reconciling numbers that had never matched in the first place. Operations scrambled to renew licenses, paying rush fees that tripled our costs. The burn rate was spectacular. I kept my head down and my mouth shut. When asked for historical documentation, I provided exactly what was requested, nothing more, nothing less. When Brad demanded I help create backdated compliance reports, I politely declined via email, citing ethical concerns with document alteration. That email went straight into my archive. Naturally. The fabrication machine was running at full speed. I overheard Brad instructing his team to reconstruct meeting minutes that would show proper oversight, watched as they created approval chains that had never existed, complete with forged timestamps. They even tried to modify our audit software to show earlier compliance checks. Ava, we need your login credentials for the audit system, Brad's assistant informed me one morning. For historical research purposes. I'm happy to run any reports you need, I replied sweetly. Just send me the specific requirements in writing. The written request never came. They found another way in. Of course, Brad had aita override my access, but by then, I'd already documented the attempt and backed up the original audit logs, showing the real dates of all system checks. The Cloud Sincera crisis hit its peak on a Wednesday. Despite Brad's assurances that it was handled, our services were suspended at midnight. By 6 a.m., our entire data analytics platform was offline. Customer complaints flooded in. Our biggest clients couldn't access their dashboards. The development team couldn't deploy fixes. The all-hands emergency meeting at 9 a.m. was a sight to behold. Brad stood at the front, his usually perfect hair disheveled, explaining how this was a minor technical hiccup and definitely not related to any licensing issues. We're in active negotiation with Cloud Sincera, he assured everyone. This is simply a misunderstanding that will be resolved within hours. From my seat in the back, I could see his hands shaking. The misunderstanding would cost us $700,000 in back payments, penalties, and emergency reinstatement fees. I knew because I'd calculated it in my May report, page 19, paragraph 3. But the real entertainment came during the leadership meeting that afternoon. With the SEC inquiry looming and our systems in chaos, the board had demanded answers. Brad's performance was Oscar-worthy. If someone had properly communicated the urgency of these renewals, he said, shooting me a look, we wouldn't be in this position. I pulled up my email and calmly read aloud, March 15th, Cloud Sincera renewal critical, April 10th. Second notice on Cloud Sincera, immediate action required. May 9th comprehensive audit report, highlighting vendor license risks. Emails can be misinterpreted, Brad countered. Real leadership means verbal communication, walking into my office, making sure I understood. I believe I was told to focus on my assigned priorities, I interrupted, reading from another email. And that vendor management had been moved to operations, under your supervision. Marcus rubbed his temples. This isn't helpful. We need solutions, not finger-pointing. Agreed, I said. I have a full remediation plan prepared. It's essentially the same one from my May report, updated for our current situation. Would you like me to present it? The room fell silent. Janet from legal nodded slowly. Yes, please. As I walked them through the steps, needed to address not just Cloud Sincera, but all our compliance gaps. I noticed Brad's face cycling through shades of red. Every slide referenced back to warnings he'd dismissed. Every cost calculation showed how much we could have saved by acting 3 months ago. This is comprehensive, Janet said when I finished. How long have you been maintaining this? It's my job, I replied simply. I update it weekly, despite recent organizational changes. That evening, I saw something beautiful, a company-wide email from Marcus announcing a renewed focus on compliance and risk management, and praising the invaluable work of our internal audit team. No mention of who had ignored that invaluable work for months. But the best part came later, when I was working late. The office was nearly empty when Brad appeared in my doorway. You think you're clever, he said. His composure finally cracked completely. Keeping your little records, playing the victim. I looked up from my screen. I'm just doing my job. Brad, the job you've been actively preventing me from doing. When this blows over, and it will, you're gone, I'll make sure of it. I smiled pleasantly. Of course. Would you like that in writing for clarity? He stormed off, but not before I caught him glancing at my screen, trying to see what I was working on. He couldn't tell from that angle that I was updating my resume, or that I'd already recorded our entire conversation on my phone, as allowed under North Carolina's one-party consent law. The fire was raging now, and Brad was starting to realize he'd been throwing gasoline on it for months. The beautiful irony was that in trying to erase my warnings, he'd created a paper trail of negligence that led straight to his office. I locked my computer, gathered my things, and headed home. Tomorrow. Legal would probably ask for my complete documentation. They'd want everything, every email, every report, every warning ignored. Lucky for them, I'd kept receipts. The email from Tasha in legal arrived on a Friday afternoon at 3:17 p.m. I'd been expecting it for days, watching the growing panic in the executive halls, listening to the whispered conferences about document discovery and SEC compliance. Now, finally, someone was ready to ask nicely for the very information they'd spent months dismissing. Hi, Ava, the email read. Hope you're having a good Friday. Quick question. Do you happen to have any historical audit reports or compliance documentation from earlier this year? We're compiling materials for the SEC response, and anything you might have retained would be helpful. No pressure. Just checking. Thanks, Tasha. No pressure. Just the company's future hanging in the balance. I stared at the email for exactly 2 hours. Not because I was debating whether to respond. I'd made that decision weeks ago. I waited because I wanted them to sweat. Wanted Tasha to refresh her inbox every 5 minutes. Wondering if I'd gotten the message. Wanted Brad to pace his office. Knowing that I held the documentation that could either save or damn him. At 5:17 p.m., when most of the office had already started their weekend, I typed my response. Hi, Tasha. See attached. Hope it helps. 3 sentences, 9 words. One attachment, Audit Final Princess Edition, PDF. But I didn't stop there. Below the PDF, I included a zip file containing something special, a folder labeled Supporting Documentation. Inside were screenshots of Brad dragging my report to his trash bin, timestamped at 4:47 p.m. on May 9th, the email threads where he'd dismissed my concerns, the Slack messages about managing the Ava situation, the attempted backdating of compliance reports. Everything a competent legal team would need to understand exactly how we'd gotten here. I hit send and immediately saw the read receipt. Then I watched my phone, counting. It took exactly 4 minutes for it to ring. Ava. Tasha's voice was carefully controlled. We need to discuss this documentation. Of course, I said pleasantly. I'm happy to meet Monday morning. Could you possibly come back to the office now? This is rather urgent. I'm afraid I have plans this evening, but I'll be available first thing Monday. There was a pause. I could hear muffled voices in the background, probably Brad. Definitely Marcus. Maybe even some board members who'd been called in for emergency damage control. Ava, Tasha tried again. This documentation raises some concerns about our response to the SEC. We need to understand the full context immediately. The context is all there in the timestamps, I said. Monday works best for me. Have a great weekend. I hung up and turned off my phone. Then I opened my laptop and watched the chaos unfold via our company Slack, which I could still access from home. The leadership channel, which I wasn't supposed to be able to see but could thanks to an IT oversight, exploded with activity. Marcus. Someone explained to me how we deleted a report highlighting every issue the SEC is asking about. Janet. The legal implications here are significant, if they can prove willful negligence. CFO. The screenshots show clear evidence of dismissed warnings. This is bad. Brad. We need to control this narrative. That report was preliminary, unverified. Janet. Brad, there's a screenshot of you calling it a paranoia doc while deleting it, in front of witnesses. The messages kept coming, each more panicked than the last. They were trying to figure out how to spin this, how to explain to the SEC why they'd ignored and deleted a report that accurately predicted every problem they were now facing. But the real beauty was in what happened next. Someone I never found out who leaked the story to TechCrunch. By 8 p.m., the headline was live. Data Fluxes faces SEC inquiry after allegedly dismissing internal compliance warnings. The article was surprisingly well-informed, mentioning sources close to the matter, who confirmed that critical audit findings had been dismissed by leadership. It didn't name names, but anyone who knew the company could connect the dots. My personal favorite quote. The company's head of internal audit had reportedly raised numerous red flags about licensing and compliance issues, only to have her concerns dismissed as paranoid by certain members of the executive team. Twitter picked it up within an hour. Had LicenseGate started trending in tech circles. Investors began asking uncomfortable questions. The board called an emergency meeting for Saturday morning. I spent Friday night in my apartment, phone off, wine glass full, watching the city lights twinkle below. Somewhere across town, I knew Brad was in crisis mode, probably trying to craft a story that would save his reputation. Marcus was likely on calls with investors, doing damage control. Legal was undoubtedly pulling an all-nighter, trying to figure out how to respond to the SEC without admitting to willful negligence. And all because they'd been too arrogant to listen to the drama queen who'd tried to protect them. I opened my laptop one more time before bed, checking my personal email. Between the LinkedIn messages from recruiters who'd seen the news and the interview requests from tech journalists, one message stood out. It was from a principal at a Denver-based fintech startup. The subject line read, "Regarding your impressive audit work at Data Fluxes." The email was brief but intriguing. They'd been following the situation. They needed someone with my evident expertise and uncompromising standards to build their compliance program from the ground up. The salary range mentioned was exactly double what Data Fluxes paid me. I marked it for follow-up and closed my laptop. Monday's meeting with legal would be interesting. They'd want all my documentation. Of course, they'd need my help to navigate the mess they'd created. But they'd also have to sit there and acknowledge that every warning I'd given had been accurate, Every dismissed concern had materialized into a real crisis. Every piece of paranoia had proven prophetic. The princess had kept her receipts, and now the kingdom was burning exactly as she'd predicted. I poured another glass of wine and made a toast to documentation, to timestamp, to the beautiful, inevitable truth that paper trails never lie. Monday couldn't come fast enough. The board meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. on Tuesday, but by 11 a.m., the entire office knew something monumental was about to happen. The SEC had accelerated their inquiry from informal to formal investigation. Our investors were demanding an emergency all-hands presentation, and Brad Keaton, our untouchable COO, was about to face his reckoning. I sat in the lobby, watching the parade of suits march through our glass doors, board members with grim faces, representatives from our largest institutional investors, our external legal counsel, billing at $1,500 per hour, and then the ones that made everyone freeze, 2 representatives from the Securities and Exchange Commission, badges visible, faces unreadable. Ava. Marcus appeared at my elbow, looking like he'd aged a decade since Friday. We need you in the main conference room, now. The room was packed, every seat taken, additional chairs brought in, people standing against the walls. At the front, a presentation screen showed the agenda. Item number 3 made my pulse quicken. Review of internal audit findings and management response. Janet from legal stood first. Before we begin, I need to state for the record that this meeting is being transcribed and recorded at the request of the SEC. The room shifted uncomfortably. Brad sat at the executive table, his usual swagger replaced by something that looked like fear. Good. The SEC has requested that we present our internal audit findings from Q2, Janet continued. Specifically, they want to understand our compliance posture and how we've addressed identified issues. She clicked to the next slide, and there it was, my report, the one Brad had so theatrically deleted, now blown up on a screen for 700 people to see via the Zoom link that had been hastily established for remote investors. Mr. Keaton, one of the SEC representatives spoke up. As Chief Operating Officer, can you walk us through how this audit report was handled when first presented? Brad cleared his throat. The report was reviewed by leadership and determined to need additional verification before action could be taken. I see, the SEC rep said, making notes. And can you explain why the report was deleted from your system on May 9th at 4:47 p.m.? The room went silent. Everyone turned to look at Brad. That was a misunderstanding, he managed. The report was moved to a different folder for further review. Mr. Keaton, Janet interrupted, her voice tight. I need to remind you that we have screenshot evidence of the file being moved to the recycle bin, along with your comment calling it a quote. Paranoia doc, princess, unquote. Someone in the investor section actually gasped. I kept my face neutral, professional, just another day at the office. Given the circumstances, the second SEC representative said, we'd like Mr. Keaton to read through the audit findings himself, to ensure complete understanding of what was identified and when. Brad's face went white. I'm sorry, what? Please read the report. Mr. Keaton, out loud, for the record. And so it began. The man who'd humiliated me in front of our colleagues, who'd thrown my work in the digital trash while calling me princess, now had to read every word of my 40-page report to a room full of investors, regulators, and board members. Page 1, Brad began, his voice cracking. Executive summary, critical compliance failures identified in software licensing, revenue recognition, and data security protocols. I watched him struggle through technical terms he'd never bothered to understand. Watched him read my warnings about Cloud Syncera, the warnings that could have saved us $700,000 in penalties. Watched him detail the revenue recognition issues that now had the SEC crawling through our books. Page 12, he continued, sweat visible on his forehead. Timeline of vendor license expirations. Note immediate action required to prevent service disruption. The investors were taking notes. The board members were whispering among themselves. The SEC representatives maintained poker faces, but I could see them marking specific sections for follow-up. By page 20, Brad's voice was barely above a whisper. The section on potential financial impact, where I'd calculated the cost of inaction at approximately $2 million, seemed to physically pain him to read. Page 37, Recommendations for Immediate Remediation. This was the part where I'd outlined exactly what needed to be done, the part that, if followed 3 months ago, would have prevented everything. The room was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning hum. When he finally reached the end, the lead SEC representative spoke. "Thank you. Mr. Keaton, one final question: who prepared this report?" Brad's eyes found mine across the room. For a moment, I thought he might lie, might try one last deflection, but with the SEC staring him down and evidence piled high, he had no choice. "Ava Burnell," he said, "our head of internal audit. The same Ava Burnell whose concerns you dismissed as paranoid." "Yes." "The same Ava Burnell who repeatedly warned about these exact issues we're now investigating." "Yes." "No further questions for Mr. Keaton at this time." The meeting continued for another hour, but Brad's career was over. Everyone in that room knew it. The investors who'd once hung on his every word now avoided eye contact. The board members who'd laughed at his paranoia doc joke were studying their phones. Marcus wouldn't even look in his direction. As the meeting concluded, one of the investors approached me. "Ms. Burnell, do you have a moment?" It was Catherine Morrison from Apex Ventures, one of our largest stakeholders. "I wanted to apologize," she said quietly. "We should have listened. Your report was exemplary, and the fact that it was dismissed." She shook her head. "Well, let's just say changes will be made." I accepted her apology graciously, professionally, but inside, I felt nothing but calm satisfaction. Not joy. There was no pleasure in watching a company implode, but there was deep satisfaction in knowing that truth, documented and time-stamped, had finally won. That evening, I submitted my resignation, effective in 2 weeks. The Denver FinTech offer was too good to pass up, and honestly, there was nothing left for me at Data Fluxus. My job was done. The paper trail had spoken louder than any words could. Brad was placed on administrative leave that night. By Thursday, his resignation was announced via a terse company-wide email. No golden parachute, no glowing farewell, just gone. They say revenge is a dish best served cold, but sometimes it's served at exactly room temperature, in a conference room, read aloud by the very person who tried to bury it. Word for word, page by page, timestamp by timestamp, the 7 seconds of silence felt like 7 hours. I watched it happen from my Denver apartment, laptop open to the Zoom call, a glass of Cabernet in hand. Brad Keaton, former COO of Data Fluxus, frozen on screen in front of 700 investors and 2 SEC representatives, trying to process what he'd just been asked to explain. On the screen, someone had just advanced to slide 13 of my original audit report, the slide that would haunt him forever. There it was, in 48-point font, Document Trail Systemic Dismissal of Compliance Warnings. Below it, the screenshot I'd captured, his cursor dragging my report to the recycle bin. The timestamp 4:47 p.m., May 9th. His comment preserved forever in our Slack history. "Nice paranoia, Doc, Princess." "Mr. Keaton?" The SEC representative's voice cut through the silence. "Can you explain this action in the context of your fiduciary responsibilities?" 1 second, 2, 3. Brad's mouth opened, closed, opened again. 4, 5. Someone coughed. Papers shuffled. The court reporter's fingers hovered over her keys. Waiting. 6, 7. We are deeply sorry for this oversight," Brad finally managed, reading from what was clearly a prepared statement his lawyers had written. The words came out mechanical, hollow. "The company takes full responsibility for any lapses in our compliance processes." But the damage was done. Those 7 seconds of silence had said more than any explanation could. In that silence, 700 investors had understood exactly what kind of leadership they'd funded. In that silence, the SEC had gotten their answer about willful negligence. In that silence, Brad Keaton's career had flatlined. I took another sip of wine and glanced around my new apartment. Boxes still lined the walls. I'd only moved to Denver the week before. starting my new position as Chief Compliance Officer at a fintech startup that actually valued transparency, double the salary, actual respect, and a CEO who'd hired me specifically because he'd read about my work at Data Fluxus. "Your documentation saved investors millions," he'd said during my final interview. "We need someone who speaks truth to power, even when power doesn't want to listen." On my laptop screen, the meeting continued its death march through my report. Each slide brought fresh humiliation for the leadership team that had ignored every warning. Revenue recognition failures, security vulnerabilities, vendor management disasters, all predicted, all preventable, all dismissed as paranoia. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah, my former colleague. "Watching Brad die inside on slide 13, you missed your calling as a screenwriter. This is cinematic." I smiled but didn't respond. This wasn't about enjoying Brad's downfall. Though I'd be lying if I said those 7 seconds of silence didn't bring some satisfaction. This was about vindication, about proof that documentation matters, that compliance isn't optional, that dismissing the messenger doesn't make the message disappear. The meeting dragged on for another hour. Brad stumbled through explanations, each one weaker than the last. Other executives tried to distance themselves from decisions they'd enthusiastically supported. The board members who'd laughed at the princess joke now sat stone-faced, calculating their legal exposure. When the call finally ended, I closed my laptop and walked to my balcony. Denver sprawled below, mountains rising in the distance. Somewhere back in Charlotte, Brad was probably in emergency meetings with his lawyers, trying to salvage something from the wreckage. Marcus was likely fielding calls from furious investors. The SEC was preparing subpoenas. And Data Fluxus, the company that was going to disrupt the industry and become a unicorn, they'd limp along for a while, maybe get acquired for parts by a competitor. The $300 million valuation was fantasy now. You can't build a unicorn on a foundation of ignored warnings and deleted reports. My phone rang. Catherine Morrison from Apex Ventures. "Ava, I wanted to thank you again," she said. "Your documentation is the only reason we'll recover anything from this investment. If you ever start your own company, call me first." After we hung up, I poured another glass of wine and opened my new work laptop. My team at the Denver startup had already sent me their existing compliance documentation, eager for my review. No resistance, no eye-rolling, no drama queen whispers. Just professionals who understood that good compliance was good business. I thought about Brad's 7 seconds of silence, how in that moment, faced with undeniable evidence of his own arrogance, he'd had nothing to say. No spin, no deflection, no Harvard MBA wisdom, just silence. They say the truth will set you free. Sometimes, it just sets you up for 7 seconds of career-ending silence on a call with 700 witnesses. I raised my glass in a silent toast to slide 13, to timestamps, to the beautiful karma of making someone read their own dismissal of your work aloud to the SEC. Then I got to work on my new company's compliance framework. Because despite what Brad Keaton had believed, paranoia isn't paranoia when you're right. And I'd been right about everything. The final call came at 9:15 p.m. on a Thursday, 3 weeks after the board meeting disaster. I was in my Denver home office, reviewing security protocols for my new company, when my phone lit up with a Charlotte area code. Against my better judgment, I answered. "Ava." It was Janet from legal, and she sounded exhausted. "I'm sorry to call so late. I have one last request." "What can I help you with?" "Janet. The SEC settlement requires us to provide a complete audit trail of all compliance warnings issued in the past year. Your documentation is comprehensive, but they want something specific, a recording of you presenting your findings, unedited, with full context." I leaned back in my chair. "You want me to record myself presenting the report Brad deleted?" "Yes. With timestamps visible and your name clearly stated, the SEC wants to ensure there's no ambiguity about who identified these issues and when." I almost laughed. After everything, the humiliation, the gaslighting, the paranoia Doc Princess comment, they needed me to create one final piece of evidence. The irony was delicious. "I have a 12-minute screen recording from when I practiced my presentation the night before the May 9th meeting," I said. "My name and title are on every slide. Will that work?" The relief in Janet's voice was palpable. "That would be perfect. Ava, I know this is awkward, but the company will provide a legal attestation that you bear no responsibility for any compliance failures. Your documentation has been exemplary. After we hung up, I found the file, Audit Presentation Final Practice May 8, 1:47 p.m., MP4. 12 minutes of me calmly walking through every warning, every risk, every recommendation that could have saved them millions. My voice steady, professional, backed by data. The presentation Brad had trashed without letting me speak a single word. I sent it with a brief note. As requested, please note this recording predates the May 9th meeting by approximately 16 hours. The response came within minutes. Received. Thank you. Your final settlement paperwork will arrive tomorrow. And that was it. The last chapter of my data fluxus story. A 12-minute recording that would become part of an SEC enforcement action. Proof that someone had tried to prevent the disaster. I poured myself a final glass of Cabernet and opened my personal laptop. My burn notice zip folder sat on the desktop. 4 gigabytes of documentation I no longer needed, but I didn't delete it. Instead, I renamed it Trust But Verify Zip and moved it to my archive drive. You never know when you might need proof that you were right. The next morning, news broke that Data Fluxus had agreed to a settlement with the SEC, $2.3 million in fines, a consent decree requiring independent compliance monitoring for 3 years, and mandatory board restructuring. Brad Keaton was permanently barred from serving as an officer of any public company. The statement mentioned systematic dismissal of internal audit findings as a key factor in the enforcement action. Tech Twitter exploded. #LicenseGate trended for 3 days. Think pieces about toxic leadership in startups quoted anonymous sources describing the May 9th meeting. One particularly scathing article was titled, How to Lose $300 Million in 40 Pages, The Data Fluxus Disaster. But I didn't engage, didn't comment, didn't even update my LinkedIn with a subtle I told you so post. I just kept building something better in Denver, surrounded by people who understood that the drama queen is sometimes the only person telling the truth. 6 months later, I received an unexpected package. Inside was a printed copy of my original audit report, bound in leather. A sticky note on the cover read, We should have listened. Thank you for trying, Marcus. I put it on my bookshelf, between my CPA certification and my new Employee of the Quarter award, a reminder that being right isn't always enough, but being right with documentation is unstoppable. Sometimes I think about Brad, about those 7 seconds of silence that defined his downfall. I heard he moved back to Boston, started a consulting firm that mostly involves giving talks about lessons learned from leadership failures. I wonder if he ever mentions slide 13. But mostly, I don't think about Data Fluxus at all. I'm too busy building something better, something built on transparency and truth instead of arrogance and denial. My new CEO actually reads my reports. My team is empowered to raise concerns without fear. And absolutely no one calls me princess. The market recovered. Investors moved on to the next unicorn. The tech world kept spinning. But somewhere in the SEC's archives sits a 12-minute recording of a woman named Ava Burnell, calmly explaining exactly how a $300 million disaster could have been prevented. Timestamp the 8th, 11:47 p.m. Status vindicated. The truth doesn't always win, but when it's documented, dated, and delivered by someone who kept every receipt, it's undefeated. Thank you so much for listening to my story of corporate revenge and vindication. I'm curious, where are you listening to this tale of audit reports and SEC investigations? Drop a comment below and let me know if you're tuning in from your office cubicle, during your commute, or maybe while working on your own documentation that someone might try to dismiss. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories of workplace justice, and share your thoughts. Have you ever been the drama queen who turned out to be right? I'd love to hear your experiences in the comments.